outside the European Union. It is true also, we have to admit it, that the crisis has hit very much our FDI capacity, although we still remain among the biggest one. But in the United States in 2010, the United States have taken over the European Union in the first role. When we talk about trade in services, I actually always talk about trade and investment in services, because what we call the word 3 is actually about establishment of board, and that is about investment. And therefore, if you look at the trade figures only, it's not sufficient. You have to look at the trade and investment figures. Well, more than 70% of all investment by the European Union were invested into services sectors in 2007. And due to the crisis, it has actually diminished, but still the biggest part of the foreign investment by European Union companies are going into services, around 55% in 29. And when we look at the green column, it is always interesting also to look at, because when you look at the definition of that, by mining and others, actually a large part is about construction, about electricity network, about gas and water distribution management network, etc., which is also a big part of the case on services. They're also looking at the integration importance of the region. On the right side, we have the outward, so investment by the European Union to the rest of the world, or by European Union member states to the rest of the world. 65% of all FDI by the EU companies are done within the European Union. So there also, I think it would be good in the future to look at the ASEAN economic community, how the investment by the ASEAN community, companies within the region is going to take place. And when we look at how the investment inward is going, also there you can see also the importance of the internal trade. A quick word on the EU current trade policy that the Ambassador has already mentioned a little bit. I'm looking at into multilateral one side. The WTO is a blue color. It has nothing to do about value here, it's about the proportion. The DDA offers on services we consider are not very good. And actually, when we hear the WTO telling us that it is about 153 countries, it is not really true, because on services there are only 30 countries. So much more interesting for our companies is actually the WTO accession process, where there indeed we have got a large number of countries since the end of the new era which have acceded to WTO and which have given us access and legal security to the access in many countries like China, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Ukraine, Russia very soon, and then Kazakhstan probably the best next one. Well, that is about the multilateral. It is still our preferred route because this is going to be a one system for all. But unfortunately, that is not the reality, and the companies have to live with what is on the plate. We have got this old FTA by the European Union, where services actually were not really an important part of the deal, and therefore the offer on services in Mexico and Chile is not really satisfactory. And then there is what I call the new style of FTA, which I call US plus FTA, i.e. we try to have the parity with what the US have obtained with other trading partners, and try to do something better, and that in substance is going much further than in the DDA or in the accession part. It's about the carry foreign agreement, which has been the first one of the new generation which has been signed up, Korea, and then Colombia, Peru, and Central America are in the process of ratification. And the Mercosur is an old agreement started in 1999, suspended for many years, and unfortunately, even if it has resumed, it is not going very much further at this point in time. So what I mean by US FTA plus is US parity, but also market access a little bit more into this. Public procurement is really important for the services sectors. It's not really sufficiently measured most of the time. And the mode 4 is an issue which is often seen as sensitive in the European Union. Also, the industry is clearly, very clearly, in favor of opening up the mode 4 into the European Union. Of course, in a change of getting access also in other countries. But we need high skills in our economy, and therefore we are able to have access to that. And now there is a new EU FTAs that are now taking place. We have a long list of FTAs which are going on, with Canada, India, Singapore, and of course now Malaysia. Last round has been taking place in Brussels last week. Others are in the pipeline. Japan, we have heard that Vietnam has been decided at the last EU-ASEAN Business Summit in Phnom Penh 3 weeks ago. So that is a list of FTAs that we want to go further, and services part is going to be very important. And in addition of what we had in the old one, we have also not only public procurement and services, but also the IPR part, the BIT, i.e. the investment protection part, the state and enterprises disciplines, maybe regulatory cooperation, which is really a must for the services sectors. And then there is a new generation of agreement which are also going to take place now, where it's not only about traditional FTA, but it is relatively to the neighborhood of the European Union, and these countries are going to negotiate or will negotiate with them what we call them, if possible, to apply the EU acquis in terms of regulation, which is making life much easier for our companies. If we look at the world map, this is where we go, i.e. we cover a very large part of numbers of countries. So our companies, yes, would like to keep the DDA as a priority, but it is stuck, we have to face it, and we therefore, as a complementary action, support very much the European Union going into financials. You have in yellow also the United States of America, because now the United States have approached the European Union, or they work together. There is a high-level working group on jobs and roles to see whether it would be appropriate to have a stronger relationship between EU and US. Of course, there it would be, at least in terms of my sectors are concerned, about regulatory cooperation even further. Now, when we talk about services, what are we talking exactly about? Import and exports. Of course, transport and travel are important because that is what we see at the cross-border, and that is easy to find figures. But an interesting figure is about 40% of all the business services, and that is where really the company activity are, is about after-sales management, is about all the activities that the companies are doing business to business, and that is where there is a lot of business going into it. Now, yes, the European Union is the biggest exporter and importer, and too often ASEAN is too shy. The ASEAN countries are already big exporters of services, even if they have difficulties to admit it sometimes. And when we put the figures all together, the ASEAN 6 will be actually the third exporters of services before China and before Japan. So there is huge potential, and I have no doubt that when the ASEAN Economic Community is going to really put into place, this will be even strengthened, and therefore, obviously, the European Union wants to have even further relationship with Malaysia and with the ASEAN countries. When we look at the effective commitment, i.e. what is binding, legally binding, and putting legal security to the companies, that is the picture we have to look at. For the European Union is the UGA, which is really old agreement. And when we look at the different countries and the different sectors, Malaysia is not that bad, but compared to 160, which is maximum possible, and the European Union is 112 average, of course there is still margin of maneuver there. And that is what we'd like to do into the EU FTA negotiation. I'm not going to go into the details of that. You know very well that FDI infrastructure services is very good for sustainable development. And something which is maybe not sufficiently well known is that when the service company decides to enter into market, it is there for a long time. It is not a pop and go. It is not, I'm going to test the market, it's not working, I'm going to leave next year. It is not about making a plan for creation of some goods and the year after they decide that outsourcing is better in another country and then they leave. The services, it's about reaching out to consumers in the country, and therefore they want to stay in. But it is also therefore important to have a strong view on a long-term basis how the market is going to evolve and how the security in the market is going to be. Also, if the service company is going to invest in the country, it needs, if it wants, we always hear about transfer of technology. Well, in services sectors, it's not about transfer of technology. It's about transfer of know-how. It's about transfer of expertise. It's about transfer of management of expertise, IT expertise of the company. A company is not going to give this if the company does not have the control. I.e., a company in the services sector is going to invest in a country, but not in the same way if the company does not have at least 51%. So I'm very pleased to hear that the government here in Malaysia is ready to move up and open up more some sectors in terms of organization and raising up the equity cap, because 30%, which is most of the bound agreement in the MITI, bound level, 30% equity cap as a max for an investor is not attractive at all for companies. If we look at the different barriers that our companies are facing up in this country, but that is also in most of the other ASEAN countries. Obligation to enter through a joint venture. As I said, if limitation of capital ownership, if we can go up to 51%, yes, okay, we can go along with a joint venture partner, and if the partnership is going well, there is no problem. Limitation of licenses allocated to foreign companies is still there. Restriction of branching, a problem. Lack of national treatment in many services sectors. Local employment requirement is not a problem for a company. Of course, a European company is going to employ local people. They're not going to bring the people from here and abroad. It's going to be much more expensive. But if you have an obligation to have 85% of local employment requirement, and if you start with a company of 2 or 3 persons, you might have a problem there. So, it's only in the figures and when we go into the detail that it is sometimes difficult. Going ahead, looking from the perspective of a services company, if the CEO or the board of management of the company is going to ask their advisors, well, we made a benefit last year, we would like to invest in somewhere, can you tell us where it's the best place for our company? What are they going to look at? They are going to look whether this country has signed an FTA or not. They're going to look at the size of the market, they're going to look at what is the competition there, they're going to look at what are the benefit prospects in short terms and long and medium term. They're going to see what is the governance level in the country, whether there are corruption or not, whether there is transparency legislation, etc., etc. They're going to look at the state of the legislation, whether you have the legislation in place, whether the legislation is really implemented, whether you have the judicial system in place if necessary. Of course, they're going to look at whether they have FDI investment incentive, like tax incentive and these kind of things. They're going to look at the level of education, so the business environment in terms of human capital, etc. And then, but that is going to be analyzed. They're going to have to analyze what is a country risk assessment. So that is about stability, and then whether there is investment protection, and whether there is an FTA or bilateral or multilateral agreement, which I can decide, which is giving legal security to the company. So let's say an FTA and the trade policy is really important to give legal security, but it's going to be one of the elements only amongst others. Very glad to hear that the number of sectors have even been expanded, and Rebecca told us that it's now at 44 services that the government has decided to open up autonomously, which is good. When we look at the CBC classification, which is WTO used for negotiation, actually it's not about 44, it's about a more limited sector. And the problem is when you go with a large number of digits, up to down to 5 digits, that is restricting the definition of the sector, and therefore obviously is giving a little bit less of attractiveness to the companies if it is really too specific. I'll conclude with this by saying we have in my organization looked at the state of play, the Europe around commitment by Malaysia, and so